Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the final Emily Hall Tremaine Journalism Fellowship for Curators. And we're joined today by Jeremy Dennis. And before I introduce him, I just want to do a land acknowledgement because I am speaking here from Brooklyn, the unceded territory of the Lenape, the Shinnecock, as well as the Haudenosaunee peoples. So welcome, Jeremy, to this event. We're very excited to have this conversation. It's been, it's been a process, and I think it's been really wonderful to learn about your work. So for those of you who don't know Jeremy Dennis, let me just do a brief introduction. He's a fine art photographer and a tribal member of the Shinnecock Indian Nation in Southampton, New York. In his work, he explores Indigenous identity, culture, and assimilation. He received a 2016 Dream Starter grant from the national nonprofit organization Running Strong for American Indian Youth to pursue his project on this site, which uses photography and an interactive online map to showcase culturally significant Native American sites on Long Island, a topic of special meaning for Dennis, of course, because he was raised on the Shinnecock Reservation. Most recently, he received the Creative Bursar Award from Getty Images in 2018 for his series, Stories, Indigenous Oral Stories, Dreams, and Myths. He holds an MFA from Pennsylvania State University, State College in Pennsylvania, and a BA in Studio Art from Stony Brook, New York. He currently lives and works on the Shinnecock Reservation in Southampton, New York. Thank you so much for joining us, Jeremy.
Hello, thanks for having me, and thanks for that great introduction.
Yeah, so I just want to say, for those of you who have questions, if you can please put the questions in the Q&A, we'd be happy to answer them as we're going along, as well as we're having a conversation. This is an opportunity to learn about his work, learn about the curatorial practice, and we'll be talking specifically about the exhibition that's currently up in Southampton that he can tell us more about. So in terms of, somebody asked about closed captioning, I believe it is enabled. If it isn't, please let me know. But when it was organized, I did ask for the captioning to be used. And for those of you who are wondering, all these talks, as well as our past talks, will be available in the form of a podcast or video for those of you who are interested. So thank you so much for joining us. And I know we're eager to talk about this. So first of all, let's start, Jeremy. I want to talk a little bit about, you're both an artist as well as a curator. And I'm wondering, how do you see those roles differently? And how are they connected for you?
Sure. Well, of course, I always introduced myself as a visual artist or a photographer first, but it was really in the last couple of years, maybe 2019, 2020, when I first started curating. And it was really due to COVID that I started doing it in a digital or online presence. And this was in association with the New York State Museum and the Preservation Long Island nonprofit. And due to COVID, we ended up hoping one day that it'll be a physical and tangible exhibit. But as an artist, I've always just been creating work that I hope one day is curated and put into public venues on display and celebrated. But sometimes, especially as an Indigenous artist or someone who does work such as mine, you sometimes have to self-curate. You kind of have to make those opportunities for yourself. And so I think that with the difference between being an artist or being a curator, it's sometimes just the fact that people don't know how to include your work sometimes. They don't even know how to talk about it in the basic sense. And so you do kind of have to take on the role of not only creating the work for it to be presented, but also being able to talk about it, with sensitivity and proper context. And so you do kind of have to step into both roles. But as a curator more recently, I've really loved the opportunity to be able to highlight and uplift other artists of color and Shinnecock artists in my community in the currently on view exhibit Outcropping in Southampton, New York.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about how Outcropping came about. What were some of the issues you wanted to grapple with? And why do you think an exhibition like this hasn't happened before this time?
Well, Outcropping actually came out of Southampton Art Center is the institution that's hosting this. It's
Mhm.
on Shinnecock traditional territory, and it used to be the old venue of the Parish Art Museum. There's a darker history of just the land itself, Samuel Parish's role in displacing the Shinnecock people, and how that connects to the 21st century. In my view, or in my interpretation, I believe the current Southampton Arts Center, their board, their staff, those who make creative decisions, reached out to me. And of course, at the time, I wouldn't call myself a curator or usually apply to those roles, but we ended up coming up with different ideas. I eventually came up with the theme of outcropping due to Shinnecock's translation. We're part of a Algonquin group of people culturally, and our name from Algonquin translates into people of the stony shore. And so with outcropping, it's sort of a reference to the erosion that happens naturally on the landscape, and sort of paralleling that fact of like we connect ourselves so much with place and with the landscape that outcropping is sort of like a sort of an erosion that's kind of harmful or hurtful. And the fact that Indigenous people, not just Indigenous people, but in this context, Shinnecock people need healing right now. We need to form community. We need to be acknowledged. And I just wanted to kind of create that open prompt for artists to respond to. And it's sort of like, sort of as my own critique or hidden critique, just the fact that like we've always been here. We've been here for thousands of years. And just like the erosion on the landscape, it's kind of like we're just being exposed now, but we've always had that strong and foundational presence.
When we first spoke about this project, and one of the things that really piqued my interest was you mentioned that this might be the first showing of Shinnecock contemporary art together as a whole. And I'm wondering, is that first of all, your experience, is that really the very first? I'm a little still in disbelief at that. And then what do you think some of the obstacles have been for that to have happened?
It's a little bit tricky, the wording around how historic and important this exhibit is. I should say that I believe it was 2013 when we established the Shinnecock Cultural Center and Museum, which is on our reservation territory. I believe it was in operation before that, but it's had some on and off years of operation. And for the past maybe 3 or so years, it's unfortunately been kind of vacant and not having open hours. But in its history, there has been different solo exhibits. It has a normal museum collection of objects, artifacts, and 20th century objects. And I would say that is kind of the major presence that Shinnecock artists have had historically. But there has never really been this dedicated show of just both Shinnecock artists in presence with one another and in communication with one another, along with this larger context of Indigenous artists throughout the nation. And so for me, this is just such a important show about creating that new connection, and the place itself being in the Hamptons or in the East End, a place that does have a very strong art community, but has for a long time tried to keep Shinnecock under the radar, or just keeping us outside of being able to pursue the arts as a career.
You mentioned that in one of your writings, that you mentioned that some institutions have made some attempts to reach out recently in the last few years. What have those been like? And I guess I'm curious to know, how has it been progressing in general? Like how open have these different institutions been? And I'm wondering, in your dream world, what would that look like for it to really sort of progress to the next level?
Oh, sure. Well, being here on the East End for 30 years, I've grown to know the Watermill Center, Guild Hall, the Parish Art Museum, and the Southampton Art Center, which is much more recent. But all of these different institutions in the past couple of years have really shown up. They've wanted to be inclusive. They've offered opportunities that pay and support Indigenous and artists of color. And so I think it's really this past, like even in my lifetime, I remember it was a pretty grim outlook for being an artist. I think there was just like no jobs, no opportunity. And maybe in the last 5 or so years have all these opportunities popped up seemingly out of nowhere. And I think it's sort of due to like 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement as probably the highlight of creating this public awareness that no, not everyone has the same grants or foundation support, or just have like that inheritance in the family. And so I think that people are starting to realize that they have power as individuals to make this change. They can contribute to marginalized communities or artist communities that are struggling. And so there is still a lot of work to do. I think that New York City, with all the different protests that are happening, are kind of echoing something that's much broader, that institutions still need to hire like people of color. It can't just be like, we have this one show, that's the one show for the year, and we don't really have to do anything else until the next year. That's still true on the East End from what I'm seeing. I think that people need to just change their outlook on like, there's just so many different personal stories in that realm of like, can we just have this token person just to check off that box or fit the quota? And so I hope that in the future, museums and institutions will begin to represent the community, even if that is just one Shinnecock person in the parish or in Guildhall or at Watermill, which I think that's definitely possible.
Absolutely. So we'll go through the exhibition and look at some of the images there. And hopefully, if people have questions, I'd love for them to sort of ask them as they come up. But also, just let's get started. One second. Okay. So this was the first image you chose for your email exhibition. And before we start, I'm curious what the experience of creating an email exhibition was for you, because obviously this isn't something that a lot of curators have experience with, and that's part of why we thought it would be a really interesting experience. But I would love to, like, how was that for you, and what were some of the challenges in general conceiving it?
I really love the format of an email exhibit. I know it's very restricted in terms of like what you can embed or what you can include, but I think still, when I was growing up in like 1995, I had AOL, you had chat rooms and emails, and back then, like the email was just like the one thing that you had to communicate with others. And it was just something that you would always check every day, every couple of hours. And I think it's so incredible that email today, with all the different social media platforms and all the instant chats, how it's still such a potent and important way to reach individuals. And so I was really amazed and happy to elevate Shinnecock's presence through the hyperallergic email chain and the email exhibit. As I said before, just the limitations of like, if you can imagine a website like Google Maps, which I love using, you can't really embed something that's interactive in that way. I think if I were to do it again, maybe embedding some GIFs or some sort of animation presence would have been interesting as well.
Well, I hope this sort of encourages you to explore that a little more. So one of the things I loved about this was you really mixed in some of the more personal and community history along with artwork. And I wonder if you'd like to talk about why you thought that was important here.
Oh, absolutely. This is such a important image because many of these individuals are great descendants or first cousins, just different ancestors of Shinnecock heritage. And the caption itself, if you can't read it, says the last of the Shinnecock Indians, LI, or Long Island, New York, 1884. And this is such an early time for, relatively early time for photography. And I think it's really interesting that it's not included in the caption, but this is actually the oldest group photo of Shinnecock people ever created.
Oh, wow.
And I think it's interesting that, like, how can you have the first image ever in history, but also claim it's the last of the people in that image? And
Right.
so I think that juxtaposition is really interesting, and of course untrue as a Shinnecock person today.
Yeah, it reminds me of the whole the trope that was sort of almost promoted of the last Indian or whatever, however they want to characterize it. It reminds me also in Canada how the only photo of the Beothuk person was also the last photo, or like supposedly the last person of Beothuk heritage. So I'm wondering about this sort of like tendency to document as almost like it disappearing. I'm wondering how that emerges in the work created by Shinnecock artists at all.
Well, one of the most famous sentiments that not only Shinnecock artists live by, but just pretty much everyone who wants people to walk away with something about us. We always say that we're still here. I think that's really difficult for people, even our neighbors here in the Hamptons, to acknowledge. We're part of a Northeastern tradition of Indigenous people who endured and were resilient through colonization. And I think that naturally, with so many people coming largely in New England area to early colonize and then bring over different demographics of people, naturally you're going to have intermarriage, you're going to mix the families. And for Indigenous people, this became a reason that we became too mixed, or are no longer who we say we are in the eyes of the United States and our neighbors. And so I think that this is an image that talks about a much larger issue that still affects us today. And one of the famous photographers of this early period of photography, Edward Curtis, he's a really golden standard example of photographers who represented this larger narrative that Native people, no matter who they are in the country, are destined to disappear or vanish for whatever reason. And so they were actually funded huge amounts of money to document us. The money that could have gone towards supporting these communities and sustaining their life instead went to these initiatives. But there is a silver lining, of course, that descendants of these people pictured in these portfolios can now see their ancestors. But I think it's a very complicated and nuanced artwork that I wanted to include in this case.
Yeah, somebody's asking about the Long Island Railroad in the caption here. I'm curious why it's listed that way.
Oh, sure. It says Shinnecock Indians, 1884, Long Island Railroad. This was actually the bicentennial of the, I believe it was either the Long Island Railroad being constructed or the US Golf Course. Yep. And so this was a huge celebration of everyone coming together. Shinnecock people took part in building the, I believe both the Long Island Railroad and the Shinnecock Golf Course that's still there today. And so just having our presence, we're only 5 minutes away from where this photo was taken, only made sense. So that kind of explains why it says that.
Got it. Okay, let's go on to the next photo. So this is obviously based partially on the last photo. Can you talk a little bit about this work and why you and your choice to make this the second image?
Oh, absolutely. This is a acrylic painting by my mom, Denise Silva Dennis. She went to school for painting and artwork, and she still practices today. During her generation, she was actually discouraged from being an artist because of her willingness or interest in painting. She comes from a generation where, like, if you weren't making baskets or brushes or sort of a duck decoys in our case, then it wasn't really legitimate Native American art. And so her educator said that you wouldn't make it as an artist. There's no career ahead of you. And so this is a painting from the year 2021. It kind of appropriates the photograph from 1884, but instead says not the last of the tenacious Shinnecock. And it's also in front of a background of our Shinnecock territory. As you can see, it's before the railroad was established, and it marks a lot of our cultural sites, from an Indian meeting house to Sugarloaf Hill, which is one of our most sacred landmarks and ancestral burial grounds. And on the bottom right, it says Shinnecock Great Neck, which is our current territory. And many people believe it's a reservation, just to simplify things.
Mhm. Got it. And so now, tell us a little bit about the tradition. And first of all, I didn't realize duck decoys were a main form of. So has that been the case for the last century or so? And do you have any idea how that began?
Oh, absolutely. Well, Shinnecock people and Montaukett people on the eastern edge of Long Island, we were deceived out of our land. We were put on these very small, restricted territories that were pretty much fenced in. And so our original life ways and ways of knowing, our traditions of gathering natural resources, was limited. And so early on, we became kind of like these migrant workers that would go on these whaling expeditions for sometimes 3 months, sometimes 6 months, sometimes 2 years. Some people just never came back, but this was due to just not being able to live the way that we once did. After that period, when the whaling population declined, we eventually became artisans who, some people say that we peddled our goods to Southampton residents. We would just pile everything on a wagon that was handmade. We would just bring it door to door. And duck decoys were among these eventually, because during the 19th century, when the Shinnecock Hills were being developed, wealthy patrons wanted to sort of go trophy hunting. And so they often hired Shinnecock hunters to lead them on these expeditions. I believe it was typically like they would bring them to the reservation, which was underdeveloped. They would allow them to duck hunt or deer hunt, and they would sell them these duck decoys as both practical uses for attracting ducks, and later local residents and art collectors brought them into their collection as valuable, sort of one-of-a-kind objects.
So let's go on to the next one. Can you tell us a little bit about this photograph?
Oh, sure. This is at our Shinnecock Presbyterian Church, which is still standing today. The church itself has a really amazing history of being pushed over a frozen bay back in the, I believe it was the 19th century. One winter it froze over, and there's no photos, of course, of this incredible feat, but part of the church that's standing today has a section of that original architecture that they pushed over. But this is a photo inside of the church from the 1950s of a lot of my ancestors. This is one of our social gatherings. I believe it could be June meeting, it could be one of our harvest feasts, but I wanted to include this image because so often when you think of Indigenous people, especially not really knowing about them for the first time, we're often taught in these very general senses. Just the fact that, like, Shinnecock's here, we had an interaction with the local residents, and then we disappeared. And so as a artist myself, and later as a curator, I really wanted to make our presence known and make our presence clear. And I just really love this image as well, because originally it was black and white. And for the email exhibit, I ended up partly hand coloring it to give it more life and bring it back to this email and digital format.
Yeah. One thing I remember with some of my own research trying to prepare, like to understand sort of the context for this exhibit, if I'm not mistaken, and this photograph sort of reminded me of that, there's been connection with the Shinnecock Nation as well as the Black populations in the region, correct? Can you tell us a little bit about that? There's been a lot of, there are a number of Black members of the tribe.
Oh, sure.
Also about how that happened?
Absolutely. I think it's still misunderstood that, like, not only in the South was there slavery in the colonies, but in the North as well, and especially here on Eastern Long Island, One of the primary places was Sylvester Manor. They had slaves, they had indentured servants. They also displaced the Manhasset Indians to our northeast. And so after slavery was abolished, a lot of these communities of color were sort of just given no support. This was also a time when Shinnecock people lost 10 of our male leaders to a moment in history called the Curatorial shipwreck. And so this was another instance when local newspapers reported the story and said this was the last of the Shinnecock, but it was some of our most important leaders who perished during this ocean attempt at trying to save a crew on the ocean during winter. And so to sort of replenish the community or to invite just different individuals into our community through marriage and through those type of relationships, we ended up having different people from the slave trade enter into our community through kinship and marriage. And so I think that that's not exclusive as well. Shinnecock people represent sort of all arrays of dark to light skin tone. And just this photo alone kind of proves that fact. I think it's really interesting as well. And a lot of people are interested in genealogy and where we all come from. And so I personally have Black heritage, Native heritage, Irish heritage. I think, as I said before, because of our location in the country and always being in this territory, you just have so many people coming through and kind of mixing in. Oh, I think you might have froze. Well, I'll let him rejoin, but Ron asked the question, can't read the bottom line on my screen. Do we know who the photographer is for this dinner photo? The photographer is actually unknown, but the photo itself comes from the Southampton Rogers Memorial Library. They have a free online digital collection of photographs from Shinnecock contributors, which is amazing. Let me just see if there's another question while we're waiting. I think Brenda asked about the Long Island Railroad credit as well, but I think we answered that. Karen says, looking forward to seeing the Outcropping show. As a curator, I've always been interested in the afterlife of an exhibit, or in our case, an event. Do you already know specific plans on continuing the thread arising from the show? Another question concerns the medium of the shows and also has to do with the afterlife. What are the opportunities? What are opportunities does the hyperallergic email exhibit offer that the physical show can't, and vice versa? That's a great question. I think that we might get into conversation later on, but I'm hoping that a lot of the artists, the Indigenous artists from Outcropping, might leave pieces behind and show them at a new and up and coming communal art space called Ma's House on the Shinnecock Reservation. And so I personally hope through not only Outcropping, but through Ma's House that Indigenous artists and the artists of color can perhaps get sales and be supported through having their presence here on the eastern end of Long Island for a longer period. And so I'm hoping that some of them will agree to do that. I think that there's some pros and cons from the email versus the physical. It's very hard to perhaps make sales from the email exhibit, of course, to support the artists who contribute. But I also think that through email, you can also reach a much larger audience, which is, I think in this case, it's thousands of recipients from the hyperallergic email. Sarah Linda says, how and who have preserved these historical artifacts, Jeremy? Is there a formal archive, or have they been culled from the community over the years? If you're referring to the email exhibit and the archival photos, these are actually from the local library's digital collection. So they exist as physical prints in private collections. They were scanned and now they're available for public enjoyment.
There we are. Go ahead, Jeremy. Apologies.
Yeah, happy it's working now. I think I was saying that this is the Shinnecock Nanawa celebration. Each year, actually before written history, this is one of our harvest ceremonies. In about a week before Thanksgiving on Thursdays, this was a community get together that pretty much all Indigenous communities from Long Island would come together just to celebrate the fact that we've had a successful harvest. And so this is something that, along with our Shinnecock Labor Day weekend powwow, is something that, as sort of an exclusion, allows the public into Shinnecock's territory. We do live in a community that's primarily residential, with a lot of our commercial and public businesses on the northern edge. And so this is really a special opportunity to engage with us. It's also an important comparison to the previous image from the 1950s that shows how important social gatherings are for us. It's part of our spirituality as well, just to give thanks as in a general sense and in a personal sense. And so this is a ongoing coming together that in more recent years, I think that Shinnecock people have been sort of orchestrating it. So there's maybe 2 or 3 Shinnecock people at each table. They sort of break up the different families and siblings just to give an opportunity for people to sit together who might not know one another, just offer that opportunity for learning. And we do, living in Southampton and in the Hamptons in general, live in such a segregated area of the country, both economically, racially, through class. And so this is a great example that I think other places with capacity could probably copy or make a model off of.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the next image then. It's saying from 1920. And those who may, I know somebody mentioned earlier they were having trouble seeing some of the text at the bottom. So I just want to mention that it says photo courtesy Pachugo Medford Library. I'm sorry, how do you pronounce that word?
Oh, Patchogue Medford Library.
Right, great. Photographer unknown. And how did most of these photos come about from your experience? Like what, are they like local family photographs that have been gathered together, or were most of them made?
Well, a lot of our history is preserved through anthropological efforts. And so anthropologists would often come to Shinnecock community, interact with willing tribal members, and oftentimes just pull photos from their collection. Oftentimes these were passed down generation to generation, oftentimes without an attribution to the photographer where it came from and who sometimes is in the photograph. And so in this case, I actually pulled this from the Patchogue Medford Library. The person who actually gave it to the library was a non-Shinnecock individual. They were actually hired by an anthropologist to pretty much become immersed into Shinnecock community. They themselves claim to have Indigenous heritage. I think it was just a case of someone being so passionate about Native Americans and our culture that they were kind of guided on this mission to just preserve who we are. I think that they were also misguided in thinking like I have heard some stories that this individual went into houses and took photographs while there were funerals or during church service, and did this to try to preserve them in his mind. And so some of these are just scanned and archived at different libraries without much information, without the sometimes the consent of Shinnecock people. But in this case, it was important to put it out in the public. All these individuals are recognized. And of course, they didn't have digital Polaroids in the 1920s. So this is a colorized image.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let's see the next image. This is a beautiful image. I love this. This is from Shinnecock powwow in 2015. I mean, I think there's no better image to show how it's very much in the present. You know, I think it's really such a vibrant photograph. So how has the relationship with photography, because like you said, because anthropologists have been so kind of part of the history of many indigenous groups in this continent, whether they liked it or not, unfortunately. So do you think it's created a different relationship for you as a photographer in terms of understanding how the types of images you're making or the types of images you display?
Well, this is such a great image to stop on for that question, because as a photographer myself, I like to dabble both with like the fullest extent of photo manipulation and Photoshop and just collaging different images together. But on the other extreme, I love just straight up documentary photographs and portraiture. Mm-hmm. And I think that by doing this type of work that's more in the realm of photojournalism, you're really going up against this larger forced narrative or forced understanding that we all have, that Native people aren't Native enough sometimes is what you hear, or that they are no longer existent or legitimate. And so as a Native photographer myself, I think that just the fact that I'm taking a photo, like a candid photo or just a family photo, means much more than as it appears. And I chose to include this image in particular. This is actually three generations, two of which are Shinnecock, and one marrying into Shinnecock. But in the background is a wigwam, one of our traditional structures. And this is actually at our Labor Day weekend powwow in 2015. The 1920 image, I can't really confirm it, but it's at a pageant that predates our present day Shinnecock powwow. Back in 1912 to the 1940s, we actually used to, both us and the residents of Southampton would reenact the moment where the European English colonists first arrived in Southampton, and that moment of contact. And so we ended up turning it into powwow as something to kind of self-determine and celebrate solely the fact that we're still here as a people.
Yep. Someone's asking about the outcrop show, if it was entirely photography. We'll have an installation shot afterwards. It is not entirely photography. So I just wanted to sort of give you a heads up there. We could talk about that a little bit too. Let's see. So this is the artwork that sort of ends the email exhibition. Can you tell us about this one?
Oh, sure. This is a gridded 2x2 painting by my older sister, Kelly Dennis, who is also a Shinnecock trustee for the past 2 years. And this is a painting that she did called Medicine Wheel Mishayu from 2003. And this was actually her senior project in high school. We both went to this very small private school, the Ross School in East Hampton. And part of the requirement is to have this sort of thesis project or presentation to graduate. And so to a lot of her educators and administrators' excitement, she created a traditional medicine wheel, which is well recognized throughout different Indigenous communities. But in her case, she really emphasized the different meanings behind the 4 directions, the 4 sacred colors. I also want to point out that she included me as a child on the bottom left. A lot of the a lot of the different issues that we were going through at the time, from just the land seizure that Shinnecock was facing on a personal level. And
that looks like on the top left. Is that on the top left there?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just the sacred circular shape being approached by a bulldozer. And so even back then from 2003, we're still facing very similar issues of our sacred Shinnecock Hills being desecrated, sold for profit, and continuously, even though we're in the age of information, the fact that people just willingly want to build on Native American burial grounds.
Yeah. You know, in the last few decades, there's been a lot of conversation, or at least maybe more reporting, I should say. I'm sure it's not very different than before, but of the tensions between the Shinnecock reservation and people and some of the other people in Southampton and their tensions. I'm wondering, have those changed over the years? Has education helped? And I'm wondering what's the status of a lot of that relationship is now.
Oh, sure. Well, in 2019, I think everyone who has come to the East End since that year has seen our Shinnecock monuments. And so I would say in the past or a more recent time, we have made our presence much more known, primarily through economic development. And we do live in this really strange part of the state of New York that is a little bit more conservative and Republican. And so I think that it's really hard to identify like who specifically is trying to continue this desecration of our lands, like who is really against just preserving or giving our land back. And so we do have a lot of allies. We have a lot of institutions and groups who are supporting us, but it's really kind of politicians that we're still waiting to sort of wake up and do what's right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So this was the last. So now talking about your choice of images overall for the exhibition, the email exhibition. Now, were there aspects of this that really that I mean, because I know you've gotten some responses from the email exhibition. I'm wondering what were the biggest surprises for some people, and for you seeing it all together. Did it help you see the topic a little differently, or I wonder how you may have thought of it? Because once you finish a project, you sort of reflect on it. You mentioned like perhaps gifts or other things could have been integrated, but I'm wondering if it gave you a different understanding of the work you're doing.
Oh, absolutely. As an artist and as a now curator, I really wanted to originally just have an email exhibit of images that sort of speak for themselves, but I still think we as a country and as a art world still need to come to terms with the lack of information or understanding around Indigenous people in general, and also the work that we produce. And so I hope and dream of the day that like Native people can just be artists or can just be showing their art just free out in the world and still be supported. But I ended up going very deep into research and captioning and putting context around these images just because there is that limitation and there is that need of education. And so if I were to do it again, I'd probably work again with Indigenous artists, but just in very sort of futuristic or unexpected ways. I just love the idea of like Second Life or VR, animated GIFs. And now I don't know if there are Indigenous people working with NFTs with the like the warming that it causes and the different issues around that. But I think that if I were to do it again, I'd probably shift to like the 2022 art that's being produced right now.
Yeah, and I believe Scowanati is in your exhibition. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yes, and it's just I just thinking of the Second Life or some of the stuff that that they've been working with. So it just reminds me a little bit of sort of that futurism that you hinted at.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is one of the works in the exhibition. Can you tell a little bit about Lisa Bowen's work and generally this Shinnecock lullaby? What is this exactly? I'd love to learn a little bit about that.
Oh, absolutely. Well, Lois Noadana is one of our ancestors who was really famous in the Shinnecock community and the East End. She was also known as Princess Noadana or Lois Hunter. She's from my family oral stories. They say that she has always worn this white regalia or this white leather dress anywhere she goes in public. She's also really known for her newspaper articles. She was also a recording artist and did oral stories that were produced on record. And she's just such a beloved figure in our community as a educator and tribal historian. And so I, in many respects, wish she were still alive today to kind of give Shinnecock the spotlight it deserves and its presence in Southampton town. And so I try to look at her for my inspiration and sort of as a guide of how to live and how to present ourselves in a way of dignity. And so for Lisa Bowen and her piece, the Shinnecock Lullaby is the song that I believe Princess Noadona wrote and performed. And the little album behind her head on the right side that features those 6 red circles, that's actually the album cover of what you can listen to even on YouTube today. And on the right is her obituary and just different photos of her in landmark land claim cases and the Presbyterian Church on the left.
Wow, beautiful. So we'll talk about this in a second. Someone's actually asked, and I'm sorry because at the time where I was kicked off, you may have answered it, but I just want to make sure. Ron Jansen mentioned or is asking if any local universities have been supportive of Shinnecock in any way. So I'm curious, have universities been supportive of your work or the work of other Shinnecock artists or the community?
This is a interesting question because like universities are so large. We've had some support from individuals. We've had support from students. Stony Brook University, I always try to shout them out because they're currently working with the Mohegan, the Unkechaug and Mastic Beach, and the Shinnecock Nation to present a Algonquin language revitalization program. And so we like to think of like university classes as being inaccessible due to their cost or their time commitment. But this is a brand new class that is only $50 to enroll. You can join over Zoom, and they have a pretty immersive and amazing class to learn our Shinnecock dialect. And so without that support and that structure, I think that we probably wouldn't be able to provide that for different students, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So that's just Shinnecock, or the Stony Brook University that is hosting that. We have a Stony Brook Southampton University as well. And the location of the university is actually on our Shinnecock Hills. And this is part of our land that was stolen in 1859. So as much as we'd love to just maybe if they return that land to us or maybe relocate their operations, I think that that's part of a much larger conflict and ambition.
So are those the hills you mentioned where the sacred burial ground is?
Absolutely. As the name suggests, the Shinnecock Hills, at each one of the peaks, we used to bury our ancestors. And the Shinnecock Hills Golf Course is probably the most dense landscape. A lot of the obstacles and the sand traps were actually different cemeteries and burial sites. And even the person constructing the course itself had a journal that described some of the digging up and displacing of these individuals.
Wow. So this piece by Ella Mahoney, can you tell us a little bit about it and why you chose to include it in the exhibition?
Oh, sure. I met Ella through the Old Stone House in Brooklyn, New York. We were in a group show together of all Indigenous artists. And I think that she had a similar presence in that show of her painting and banner work. This is one of her installations that are sort of free hanging, called Wind, Water, and Waves from 2020. I really love this work because in my personal work as an artist, I do a lot of looking at the past, trying to connect it to the present and making some sort of relevant statement. And so this is a story of an individual named Moshop from her tribal tradition of storytelling. She's from the Wampanoag tribe on, I believe, present-day Martha's Vineyard Island. And so in her community, this individual named Moshop helped shape the land. He helped provide nutrients and food to the Wampanoag people through whale hunting. And he disappeared at the end of these stories, promising to return if he's ever needed. So I think it's such a awesome and sort of cliffhanging story of Wampanoag's resilience. Like, they've been around for such a long time that they haven't needed Moshop to return, but it's also a promise that this story has not completed yet. It's sort of something that we never know when he'll return.
Yeah, and so those of you who want to see, this is an installation shot, and somebody's asking where the exhibit is. It's at Southampton Art Center in Southampton, New York. And you know, the exhibition has been quite large based on the photos I see, or at least it's pretty sprawling. Were there any real challenges putting the show together, and what were those?
Well, the show itself features more than 45 Indigenous artists. About 12 of those are Shinnecock artists. And this is a installation shot that I included that is called the Shinnecock Room in my eyes, because it's sort of separated in that way. And I think the difficulty was the fact that because of our location in the United States, like, the most amazing Indigenous art that's happening right now is sometimes bulky, sometimes it needs the artist to be there in person to install it. We have all these different like dream projects and dream artworks that we want to include, but like you kind of have to pay attention to the budget and like what is really possible for this 3-month exhibit. And so when I started to curate this show, it is such a huge space, but I just wanted pretty much everyone I look up to, like all the different Native artists that are working today, to be included. But as someone who is working on a physical show outside of like online exhibits or installations, it was a little bit frustrating to, especially like people that you just like Google Indigenous artists and their name comes up, just like the difficulty it is as an Indigenous artist to reach out to them. Sometimes it would be like months of like no response, or you would have to go through assistance, or you would have to like legitimately they would be like protesting Instagram or Facebook, which I sometimes use as a curator. A little bit unprofessional, but I think that just the different ways of getting everyone included was one of the frustrations, because it is such a historic show and it is sort of a once in a lifetime thing. And bringing in to my community all these really amazing artists was sort of the goal, or sort of the vision. And so I'm hoping now that the exhibit is up and it exists, that this will just be a beginning point. Maybe it'll be revisited next year or in a different venue with different artists or new works. And so I hope everyone that's listening is able to see it before it's deinstalled on April 9th.
Yeah, and somebody's asking the actual street address. I just looked it up. It says 25 Jobs Lane in Southampton, New York, if anybody is interested. So 25 Jobs Lane. You know, one of the things when we spoke to Tani Atone, the curator for the Kiowa tribe, one of the things that came up a lot was the issues around the different protocols around showing work. And I wonder if there are any unique protocols or anything people should know about when approaching the Shinnecock Nation or the Shinnecock artists that might be appropriate to share.
Oh, sure. Well, we at Shinnecock, I can just speak for this small community. We're located in such an affluent area of both the country and in the world. But according to the 2010 census, I think we had like a median income of like a family income of $10,000. And so I think that people expect Native, well, not only Native artists, but Native people in general to just volunteer their time, that we just can be the experts of everything, and that they can just enter into the community, try to like be the videographer, be the oral story recorder. And so we are pulled in all these different directions, and we have so much like threshold for what we can contribute and volunteer and offer. And so I think that people approaching Shinnecock just need to know, like, if are you offering the same resources that we're offering? Can you support us the same way we're supporting like your Guggenheim grant or your big fellowship, or you're probably getting funded so much for your time and we're just trying to survive. And so that's one of the major things that I have been trying to fight for in different curating projects that I approach, just like how are we supporting the artist? How much commission do they get if they get a sale? Can we ship their work for free? And so on.
Yeah. Someone's asking about the flowering of arts activities among the young in the Shinnecock, and how integral is that part of the education of being part of the community? I'm just going to add that part, but also in general, what role is the arts playing today?
There's a lot of different art practitioners here at Shinnecock. I would say or admit that they're a little bit older generation right now. I think we're still in that mindset that like art is a hobby. It's not really practical. We kind of have that old-fashioned worldview, but I'm hoping in my personal practice to open the doors to those who do want to, and them jobs and opportunities that can actually be a future for them. And so we have a annual Labor Day weekend powwow that's only 4 days out of the year. That's the highlight of sort of being able to dance, being able to be a vendor for your art and putting it out in the world. But I think that the outcropping show and anything that comes afterwards will just open people's minds up to the realization that, like, as a young person, this is a career that's viable. There are different open doors and places for you to belong.
Yeah, so have you already seen a shift during the last few decades, or has there been a shift or an embracing of the arts in a different way?
I think that's still a big thing that we still have to pursue and overcome. I think we're doing it on a personal level, but I think still there's not like a lot of like scholarships, for example, or even at the high school level, just making that understood that you can do this. It's not just a shame to go into this route of arts or art administration.
Yeah. So if there are any very last questions, we're at the 8 p.m. mark. This has been really interesting. Thank you, Jeremy. This has been, it's been really fascinating to me that as I talk to other people, the people's knowledge about Shinnecock, people that otherwise will know other indigenous groups in the US or North America or Turtle Island, it's amazing how their knowledge about Shinnecock seems to be very limited in general. And it's really, I've been really curious. Have you thought about why that has been specifically? Because I mean, it's not like New York isn't, you know, a big city where people are sort of exploring so much. Any thoughts on that?
Well, there's a great book by Thomas King called The Inconvenient Indian, and we are sitting on millions, if not billions of dollars worth of real estate. So if you can erase this in the minds of like the capitalistic state or viewpoint, then you can undermine our sovereignty, you can undermine our federal recognition, and try to get us off of our valuable land. And so I think that people are just trying to question our legitimacy. I think that there's also not only the land that we have today, but the land that is rightfully ours that should belong to us, that a lot of people are unwilling to part with. And so I think that keeping us quiet, like keeping us obedient, like this is just the way things are, you're too late to make things right, is the kind of sentiment that we've been hearing all around our neighborhood. And so we're hoping that'll change. I think that this opportunity through Hyperallergic has really broadened our understanding and shown a lot of people that are like in a driving distance, like of an hour, that we're right next door. We're still thriving. We're still strong people, and we have a strong future ahead of us.
Yeah, no, someone's just chimed in and said, born and raised in New York, and they learned so much tonight. So I think your work is definitely raising this. And somebody's just one last question. Someone's asking about Ma's house. What exactly is that? If you want to just explain that as a final question, that would be great.
Oh, sure. With COVID and social distancing, pretty much all my different residencies and gallery shows were canceled in 2020. And so in June of that year, my family and I ended up restoring this old family home that was pretty much ready to fall in on itself. It needed like every utility replaced. It needed like all the materials of the walls redone. And so over a year time, we restored it through community funding like GoFundMe, individual contributions. And so as an artist who couldn't afford that, we ended up using that reciprocity to turn it into a communal art space. And so it will be a destination year round that will feature a artist of color residency. It'll be a venue that I and my partner, Brianna Hernandez, can curate shows and support different artists throughout the country. And it is something that we're still working on renovating, but it'll sort of be sort of an answer to that earlier question of like, what's after Outcropping in the Southampton Art Center and this hyperallergic fellowship.
Yeah. And so where is the venue? Somebody is asking. I think people are really eager to see this, so that's a good sign. But where is Ma's house if they want to visit it?
Oh, it's in Southampton, New York, on the Shinnecock Reservation. We're about 2 hours east of New York City, either by car or by train, and it's always open by appointment. So yeah, please don't just show up.
So write them, call, and figure it out. That's great. Well, I mean, I'm very lucky that I feel like, I mean, I think a lot of us have learned a lot from this project, and I think it's really incredible. And I'm just glad that your work is being shown and you're creating the context for it, which I think is really important for artists to do. And I think your work as a curator has been really interesting because you're allowing, you know, that context to emerge. And be in dialogue with the artists that you would like to be in dialogue with. So thank you, Jeremy, for your work. And thank you, everyone, for attending. And I'm sure this will not be the last we've heard from you.
Well, thank you. And thank you, everyone, as well. Such a pleasure.
Great. Thank you.